Hello and welcome to SHL Fireside Chat. I'm Lance Andrews. I'm joined by Renee Barr as always. So you're going to see something a little bit different this time around on our show. We're going to take a few moments to set the stage for our conversation with our guest and let you know where that conversation goes. So Renee, how you doing?
Okay, hanging in there, which I guess I've not realized I say most of the time. So maybe, to take a step back on that, it's been interesting. I've noticed that it's like we're entering a new phase, and as things are starting to open up, it almost unveiled all these new decisions we kind of like have to start making about, do we continue to social distance the same way? What do we start doing differently? I'm in Texas, so we've been open since May 1st in some capacity. And I'm in my head a lot about what do I do and what does my family do and what childcare is going to be available in the summer and how do we feel about that and all of those things. And it's kind of interesting to realize in some ways I look back on 3 or 4 weeks ago as a simpler time where the rules were very clear about what we did and what we didn't do. And now, that's, I guess, the new source of stress for me.
Yeah, it's that whole like can I versus should I, now that the optionality is there. Like I noticed even with my wife thinking about the things that we have a few more options now in Minnesota as well. It's kind of slowly opening up, and things from haircuts, talking for 20 minutes with my wife, like, when is it okay? When do you think that, how long should we wait, even though we can now? Like, it's good problems to have, I guess, but it does create a new layer of considerations that weren't there just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And even I was noticing too, just in thinking back and reflecting, like habits are forming more quickly than I thought. Like I started off even working from home, had a good routine. I was working out in the morning, and then just takes like a couple weeks to undo that. And so like I've been walking by my Peloton for the last 2 weeks and not getting on it. And it's like, once you get in those ruts working from home, I think, I'm having some, adjustments personally. When you have going into the office, those things are more routines, and kind of setting those boundaries for myself are something I'm reflecting on a lot more now too.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's kind of like the rut element, but also the stress element as we're going through different pieces of that, kind of thinking about like the phases I feel like we're all going through. And, I guess that's actually, so when we talk to Richard, well, the first thing he's going to, talk about with us is this research that he was able to jump on and kind of get going really quickly with a group of workers about their experience since really like COVID in the start of the shutdown. So he has all different kinds of people in different jobs, some of whom have been working in person because they're essential the whole time. Some people who started off at the beginning of his study, they were working in offices and then or somewhere live face-to-face and then went remote. People who were remote and then now are starting to go back, and looking at how that impacts all kinds of things like, work, family work conflict, stress, productivity, job performance, like all of these kinds of things, which I think is going to be really interesting. I'm glad that somebody is like jumped on that to do the research so that we can go back and try to learn from what we're experiencing here. And then we kind of like that conversation morphed a bit into hearing a bit about what it's like to be an academic right now, or, in a university, both from the perspective of doing research, of teaching graduate students, undergrads. So a real kind of window into that world. We got a little bit of, and then I guess, of course, we couldn't talk to Richard without kind of talking about how technology impacts the world of work in pre and post COVID. And I think our conversation there kind of went towards, candidate expectations pre and post COVID and what that means for how technology is being used in the recruiting and selection process. And so I think there's some interesting food for thought there for all of us.
Yeah, just kind of the spirit of the show. We wanted to connect people that have either data or using their perspective or their unique positions to help inform the world. And so I think this was a great example. We talked about this in the discussion. Richard was able to really quickly mobilize a research study that, I think that's, as an I-O psychologist and, a social scientist, that's an obligation almost we have to help organizations and people have data to inform what they do. So I think, Richard was one of the people we knew he was doing this. I found out he was doing this research. So to introduce him, and we'll bring him on in a moment here, but Richard Landers, he's the John P. Campbell Distinguished Professor of I-O Psychology at the University of Minnesota. He runs a lab, so his focus is on some of the newer frontiers. It's called the TNT Lab. It's the Testing New Technology in Learning, Assessment, and Behavior. He's a newly minted SciOp fellow. We talked about that. So it was a good discussion. We talked about, not only the work-life balance, but getting that selfish, learning about getting his take on gamification was fun. So enjoy the conversation with Richard Landers. Richard Landers, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So as we mentioned in the intro, Richard, you're the distinguished professor, the John P. Campbell Distinguished Professor of I-O Psychology at the University of Minnesota. You've got your hands on a lot of things. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you have going on and what you're really focusing on in your research and your teaching at the University of Minnesota?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I'm on the I-O Psych side at the U. We have folks doing psychology applied to work both in the business school and in psychology. So I'm more on the psych side. And my lab basically focuses on how can we use technology to improve employee selection, employee training, and research methods. How do we study people and organizations? So in practice, that ends up playing out in a few different ways. We look at things like virtual reality. We have a big virtual reality project actually going on right now. Technically, it's a little disrupted as a result of physical distancing, but have one that's primed to start up. We've shifted a little bit because of the pandemic into doing work that doesn't require co-located, with research participants. So we've done a little bit more on the artificial intelligence and machine learning side here recently, seeing if we can get new interesting insights out of data from those techniques. And just in general have been just trying to understand, we try to understand how can we use technology better than we do. I think a tendency especially in the business world, is that if everyone else is doing it, we should too. So especially, at least with technology, that's very true. In a few other areas too. So often we see technologies become very popular, and a lot of people jump in saying, oh, we need to get, like, gamification was actually a big thing that we do. We saw we need gamification in our hiring system, or we need gamification in our performance management system. And when I asked people why, they were like, because that's what people are doing right now, so we need to do it too. So trying to understand if that's actually a good idea, how can it be used and misused, and provide advice on those issues, that's what we try to do.
Cool. And I think, for the I-O Psychologists, you didn't get to go to have the conference in person this year, but I understand that you're recently awarded a SciOp Fellow, so congratulations.
Thank you.
This could be your ceremony here with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I'm actually not totally clear on what the benefit of it is yet. There's a breakfast I missed. I know that. It's really great. But yeah, I'm actually not sure if there will be some kind of makeup event next year, because there's like a ceremony and all sorts of little things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a deserved recognition, and the stuff you're doing in your lab, and wanted to talk to you for sure, because you've got a lot. You're kind of one of the people that I look to personally as having a good perspective on some of these next generation things, and one of the academics is really out there, kind of pushing the science practitioner in pushing the research edge there. So
yeah, thank you.
Very deserved. Congratulations.
Yeah, crossing the line is very important to me. We've ended up with a little bit of a bifurcation in terms of research, like priorities in academia. I feel like in I-O, at least, it's not exactly the same in other disciplines or subdisciplines, but a lot of what now gets published is published because you're adding what an academic would consider an interesting box or arrow to an existing path model somewhere, which can be useful. It just often isn't. So figuring out, and it's part of the motivation. I'm actually writing a research methods textbook with Tara Behrend. And one of the things that we're really trying to push in that is why not creating theory for the sake of theory is the most useful thing to do necessarily, that it really should always be in service, not necessarily within one study, but should be in service of some long-term practical applied value. So all the research that we do is really targeted that way. Even if we're doing more basic research in one study, it's still targeted at for some reason. There needs to be some actual applied value to what we're doing at some point. And I think a lot of people don't even spend the time doing it. So thinking through, like if you're a researcher adding boxes and arrows to a model and you're not even thinking about how this could be used in the real world, like no one else is ever going to do that either. So it's a big part of what I try to do.
If you're adding nuance to something very esoteric to begin with, then it's, what is the practical value? Like finding new things to study.
It's I mean, it's a rough place. There's also a lot of there are a lot of pressures for tenure and graduation and getting jobs and everything else. It's just we've created this system ourselves and we need to fix it.
Well, speaking of research, I think the reason I reached out and what we're interested in knowing doesn't need to be the whole topic of conversation, but I know you are doing some research on telework and people's transition to telework and gathering some data, and I know it's kind of still ongoing. It's a longitudinal study, but you want to tell us a little bit about that? That's kind of one of the first reasons I reached out about this. What are you looking at and what are you finding if you're in a place to share anything?
Yeah, we're still, it may not sound like early stages, but it's early stages. So we're following about 500 to 600 people week by week in terms of how they're essentially adapting to their work environment in relation to the pandemic, and especially in relation to their transition to telework. So we essentially went initially on to Prolific Academic, which is like a better version of MTurk in a lot of ways, and went on to Prolific and found got about 800 or 900 people in round one, and then we kept from that group the people who were still employed, and then have been asking them questions. We're now about to launch today, actually going to launch week 8, so we've got about 2 months of data. And the goal of that project was really primarily to identify who is it that is adapting best to telework, who might need more support, so who might be slipping through the cracks a little bit, and are there any systematic discrepancies between genders was a big issue that we were worried about, trying to figure out who gets saddled with childcare and how does that affect their ability to telework and those kind of issues. We mostly just been collecting data because everything else is continuing to happen. So this is sort of in the background as every week there's a new round of data collection. So I haven't dug too deep into it. What I have done is looked a little bit at who we've got and what they're doing and the general patterns in in how their work is changing. And I've looked at some gender differences within the data that we have, and well as childcare related differences. The sample is about 40 to 50% of people describe themselves as gig economy workers, which makes sense because then Prolific and doing web-based surveys is like another thing they're doing. Mm-hmm. So we have then the other half are full-time or part-time employees, sometimes in combinations of different jobs. So the full-timers are the ones that I'm really most interested in. We have I think about 190, maybe 200 of them in terms of what their transition has looked like. So it's a pretty diverse sample, a little heavy on the gig side, but still a pretty good set of jobs. A lot of teachers, a lot of retail workers, as you might expect. I also do have some variety beyond that. There's a number of traditional white collar sort of jobs in there that are floating around too, office workers. In terms of people's experiences, full gamut from people that have been working full-time in person and forced to stay in person this entire time. Essential workers, a lot of healthcare folks, that was surprising. There are, hospital like technicians, we have a few nurses, it's just a big group. But all the way from in person, staying in person the whole time, some people that started out in person and transitioned to telework, some that were already teleworking when they started, and now starting to see some people going back into the workforce. Just saw the first glimpses of that, just a handful of people last week, and I expect there's going to be a lot more of them. Yeah. So the cool thing about that then is we can be a little more confident in our causal conclusions to say that when somebody goes away and comes back, that the changes we're observing, we're a little more confident that's actually because of the transition and not because of other things going on. So that was just a cool characteristic of that data set and why we've been really targeted on it. What surprised me so far about the results are really the differences we're not seeing. So I'm looking at self-reported productivity, self-reported job performance. There's some limits with that. And self-reported work-family conflict and family-work conflict. We have a variety of demographic variables, like what's the age of the youngest child you have at home? Did you have children, appear in your house that you now have to deal with? Those kind of issues. And we actually don't see nearly as large of gender differences as I expected. Now, having said that, I've only looked at the data in aggregate. I haven't done that cut down into full-time versus like gig worker type things. But for the overall group, for the 500 to 600 of them, there's not really very substantial differences in terms of productivity. If anything, men are actually reporting worse productivity. I don't know if those results are like practically significant at this point, but and it's also because it's self-reported. You don't really know if that's just because, for example, these are things that I want to investigate the data set, but haven't. But for example, if more men than women in the sample transitioned from traditional full-time roles and more women, for example, are on prolific already, carefully balancing family and work by doing more gig economy work and such, then maybe those differences wouldn't be as big. I don't know. But at least in the sample overall, the differences aren't all that substantial. Work-family conflict is actually also about the same, and family-work conflict. I did ask people to think backwards and say, before this all happened, what were you doing? And I haven't looked at those data yet, but I'm also wondering if what could be happening is that now that more people are at home and teleworking, now a lot of the traditional differences, gender differences that you see contribute to these family-work conflict issues are because men are now having the same struggles that women typically have and are now being more impaired in a similar way. And that's why we're not seeing too many differences during this at-home period. How that will change as people start going back to work, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if we'll end up running into the fall, but we also have a sizable number of people who have college students that have come back home. They actually complained because my survey only asks, do you have children 18 or under living at home? And several people messaged me saying, I've had a 20-year-old and a 22-year-old come home and they have destroyed all of my productivity work. And you didn't ask me a question about that and I'm annoyed. So yeah, it's a really interesting mix. I'm really excited about what it's going to end up looking like and what kind of other interesting conclusions we can get out of it. But it was really important in the beginning to jump as quick as we could in terms of collecting data because of the initial transition. We still had to go through full IRB and everything. So we had already lost the initial week of the pandemic. We ended up running it 2 weeks in, which was an amazing turnaround for an IRB, but still means that we missed that initial cutover point for a lot of people. So as folks go back to the workforce and then or go back to the in-person workforce and then potentially transition out as we have kind of a wave of stay-at-homes versus traditional back-at-work employment, maybe we're going to see some interesting transitions going back and forth between that. But yeah, that's what I'm hoping to figure out.
As you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about, it was also pinging off of, we talked to Maya Garza a couple weeks ago and started thinking about this idea that everybody's kind of in some ways almost experiencing a similar level of stress with just different things factoring into it. And she didn't say this, but almost like the image I have in my mind is kind of like we're feeling stress and it's going to be attributed to whatever is going on in our life. potentially. And so what that was making me wonder was like the work, family work conflict and the reported like lack of maybe expected differences in productivity is potentially where even, and I know you don't know this yet, it's just where my mind is going, even if potentially there are some gender differences on where the dealing with kids, for example, is playing out, even if say 70% of that is going to the female person in the home and only 30% of it is going to the male person in the home, but that 30% is new for the male person and that 70% is only a 20% increase for the female person. They could experience like the same amount of stress, or feelings of loss of productivity, even with differing objective amounts of care. And I don't know enough about probably even how work, family work conflict is typically measured at this point in the literature, much less like how you're measuring that. But it would be interesting to see, if there was the opportunity to understand how that perception plays into it, kind of almost irrespective of the objective amount of something that you're facing.
Yeah, it's a big challenge with doing the self-reported productivity and job performance metrics because people are essentially comparing to their previous normal.
Right.
I wonder if the worse outcomes for men are not really because things are worse, but because relative to what they were doing, yes, they feel it more. Whereas the women are like, yeah, it's just this. I mean, it's a little harder, but I'm dealing with it. And for men, it's just at least on average.
Yeah.
It's more change for them, and they're interpreting their loss in productivity to be more severe. Hard to pull apart though.
Right.
Yeah, something. One of the issues also that's related to that is, and actually I'm on a panel for PsyOp on this topic. A question of, to whom can you really generalize from research collected during a pandemic? Can I really only draw conclusions about the pandemic, or in what situations can we talk about, like, these are more general patterns of people going in and out of telework? So it's a big issue for the research that's going to come out of this period, and it directly speaks to this problem. Is it because there is a new pandemic normal that people are comparing themselves to, or is it because of the actual transitions that we're observing, or probably more likely some combination of the two?
Right. But it seems like, if nothing else, like there is value in like the research that you're doing now, and it happens to be inside of a pandemic, if it illuminates trends or potential like hypotheses in a way that would have been hard to capture normally, and then you can focus your attention on seeing in the future, does that play out during non-pandemic situations? Like, there's value there, even if it's not an exact map and if it's more than we knew before.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of the motivation, because we've never before, and probably will never again, see such a large migration to telework. Or to remote work, sorry, the more correct term. If we can get some useful insights out of that, I mean, honestly, I'll be happy if this even generalizes to, future public health crises. There's some evidence to suggest that this kind of thing will happen more often in the future. So if we're a little better prepared next time, and we can say, okay, we know that people with, kids at these ages or this situation at home are going to struggle more, and can provide more support to them next time, like that is enough for me.
Yeah. And one disclaimer I almost feel like I should make, like, because I know, like, I'm, like my past example was kind of assuming like 70% on the woman and then like 30% on the man. And my actual personal home situation is that my husband is doing a lot more of the manning of the child situation than I am. So I definitely know there are exceptions. And maybe connected to that, the other idea of, I think there's value in having a sense of like how much objective work someone is doing in a particular area and how that relates to their stress, but there's still the element of whatever stress people are feeling, regardless of where it comes from and the exact objective amount that was directing towards that, the experience they have with that and how that impacts their work and their well-being and their productivity and their family life is all meaningful. I guess, beyond the sense of like, is it right that someone is feeling what they're feeling in relation to the amount of work or family conflict or whatever they're having, maybe isn't necessarily the full point, which I think I'm more clarifying for myself than like insinuating that you said that, but thinking it through. But certainly, it's really fantastic, like you were saying, that you were able to get through the IRB and everything so quickly to jump on the research and time to be able, early enough to see all these transitions and people moving in and out. It makes me think a lot of, I was an undergrad during 9/11 and was in a memory class, and the professor there was able to get through IRB quick enough to do some really interesting light bulb memory kind of like research on that, and the ability to see and then take advantage of the opportunity that's there for the good that we can learn from it in the middle of all of this is really, it's heartening.
Yeah, it really varies by institution. What Minnesota did is they actually set up a emergency IRB COVID committee. So if you had COVID in the title of your submission, that went through this emergency fast review process. And we got back, so normally at Minnesota, a full experimental study that you submit would take at least 3 weeks, maybe 4 or 5. And even exempt research like this is just survey research, so it's considered exempt. That would still take that's still usually 3 weeks. And even after 3 weeks, you would get revisions, and that would be another 2 weeks, and revisions again, you get another. It's actually very intimidating when you go to submit, because it shows the timeline and where you are. There's pre-submission, submission, pre-review, review, post-review, finally acceptance. So there's a lot of steps, and we actually we progressed through multiple steps and submitted revisions on the same day. So they were just nailing it in terms of speed to get stuff out there. So it was very fortunate for us. I've heard other academics that have not had that kind of success with their IRBs. But yeah, we were definitely very lucky here that they were ready.
Yeah.
And maybe I don't assume that you're researching this in parallel, but just maybe anecdotally, and I know we're not supposed to rely on anecdotes, but transitioning as a professor and then your students transitioning immediately to the telelearning, remote learning, distance learning, that's the word, right? Distance teaching. So how has that been for like your students? Have you noticed a kind of a roller coaster of emotion maybe, but you have experience teaching, virtually in some of the tools, but did you notice any trends there?
Yeah, well, so I've been teaching online for 7 or 8 years. So I had a lot of experience with it personally. Most of my students, I don't think, did. I was only teaching graduate courses this semester, so I only saw this through the lens of grad students. Definitely not a traditional Socratic, engaging back and forth discussion as you would hope to have in grad school so much. The online environment does not really encourage that so well. The anonymity, I only had 8 students in, I taught a data science class, I only had 8 students in there, but it was very obvious that the level of engagement would just dropped. We usually have back and forth, and I would ask open-ended questions and that kind of thing, and it was okay, but it was not the same as the in-person experience. And a lot of online undergraduate instruction is actually designed around the idea of people having a fulfilling asynchronous experience. Because traditionally, if you take an online class, it's because you've got other stuff going on. Yeah. So you would want to be able to schedule your courses, do your coursework at night or on weekends or whenever. So there's a big push to not have synchronous, required meetings. But what's different is that because we transitioned mid-semester, a lot of people literally just tried to pick up their course and shove it online. And it just, for a lot of people, did not work very well. We're now recovering from that. There's all sorts of initiatives, at least in Minnesota, there's all sorts of training initiatives. And I've been on a couple of university committees trying to work through how do we prepare people. It's made it very obvious to me just how large the skill gap, at least, is right now, and what needs to be done in order to recover it. Because people will say things like, oh, well, normally I would have an exam, on Thursday, and it'd be 30 minutes in the beginning of class at 12:30. So that's what I'm doing online. Everybody has to log in at 12:30 on Thursday, and they've got 30 minutes to finish this exam. They're like, maybe don't do that. There are some downsides to that plan. But it's, the idea of online pedagogy is new for a lot of people, and it's definitely been challenging for some folks. I think that we already don't train most professors super well in teaching, but they at least have absorbed through osmosis, in a sense, the courses they've taken, and hopefully have thought through, how can I use that as a model for what I want to do? And you see, even like, especially in graduate instruction, you see people tend to take the style of their advisors when they go on somewhere else. Yeah. And for undergraduates, the same. Like, you took undergraduate courses and you kind of have an idea in your head of what that should look like. So even if you were never explicitly trained in teaching, you still have that. For online, it's missing. So a lot of people have never taken an online course, and they're suddenly asked, like, figure out Blackboard or Canvas or whatever, and teach people through this random software that you kind of already hate. So it is just not great. The fall will be really interesting, because there's still some institutions that are planning to be fully in person, which is crazy to me. There are some that are fully online, and then there are a lot that are doing weird combinations of those things. So hopefully in education, we're actually going to see a lot of really interesting research about those kind of transitions also. Professors and teaching, it is a profession, it's a job. I don't know if any I-Os are on that yet, but they should be, because it's a very convenient sample to get access to right now. And there's definitely some transitions to not just telework, but to tele-education, tele-research. That's remote research has been a big challenge. One of my collaborators in computer science is a full VR researcher, and like 90% of his work was bringing people into the lab and having them put on a VR headset. And so this has been a really big challenge for his workflow, trying to figure out how to deal with that. And we even just had a conversation a few days ago about, well, when we transition back in the fall, here's a device that you can dip a VR headset into, and it will bathe it with ultraviolet light. And then you can take off these, this piece, and you have to use a sprayer within this area because germs could be caught in this vent over in this. I mean, the level of detail in terms of paying attention to disinfection procedures is really fundamentally changing a lot of research in ways that, it's a job transition, just like for everybody else. So yeah, hopefully somebody's doing some work on that. Not in my plan yet.
Speaking of VR, and I know that you mentioned you're looking at some of the virtual reality applications for testing and selection, and also gamification. We chatted about this over email a little bit, but I just want to get your perspective. Gamification has been all the rage. Renee and I focus on testing primarily, but in performance management and gamification thrown into sales dashboards and your CRM systems, all those things that add elements of gamification. So what are your thoughts on, as we enter this period of higher unemployment or record high unemployment, how does gamification and just the applicant experience need to be reconsidered or rethought, if at all? But do you have any thoughts on some of the trends and how those play out into what we should consider as organizations?
Yeah, it's complicated because there are a lot of opposing forces right now. So on one side, you have record high unemployment, and even if tomorrow the virus were to disappear and we'd have a full economic recovery as such, it still wouldn't overnight change the market. So we are facing a new type of job market for a while. I would guess at least a few years. And traditionally, in poor economic conditions, we do move more toward a selection model than a recruitment model, where since we have an overabundance of competition for jobs, that means that we now have the luxury of choice. At the same time, there is a practical dimension of that and an ethical dimension of that, where people are struggling, the ethical side, and adding more hurdles and making things harder to get a job, probably not not the nicest thing to do right now. And I think that especially as we've seen more mobilization around ethical violations on the internet, that if someone did something that was particularly bad, then it could bring a lot of negative press to that organization in the current environment. And we're already seeing a little of that in other areas, with Amazon's getting a lot of negative press, for example, for how they're handling their warehouses. Those kind of things are going to become more common, I think. So we have to be cautious. Games are a really interesting, games and gamification both are a really interesting potential tool in that environment. So on one hand, gamification done badly is very easily perceived as being manipulative and as being controlling over people's behavior. And so in a situation where people are already stressed and are having to deal with the new normals that they have to deal with, that could be perceived as being bad. At the same time, gamification itself is really just, we push in the literature that gamification is a design process. It's one where you take data about your current situation and you try to understand what people's experiences are in that situation, whether that's in the hiring or in performance or whatever it is, and then saying, how can we inject a little bit of the magic of games, whether that's targeting, how do we get people to get more flow states? How do we get people to enjoy it more? How do we get people drawn in more? Whatever game type goal you might have. And then how can we redesign the experience they're having in order to get to that goal? So games as a force for good can play out the same way in a gamification process for an organization. If in the hiring process, for example, you use narrativization, that's a very common gamification technique, and you were to say, you know what, we're going to try to convey to you, here is how you would be a part of the organizational family if you were to come here, and through the testing process, we're going to put you in the shoes of someone who would be in that world, and you're going to get to see what it would be like, and you can imagine how your life would be better working here, like those kind of things. And I don't think anyone would have a problem with that. I don't think people would react negatively to it, because it is fundamentally making the experience better. In a sales environment, on the other hand, if you gamify by saying, let's just throw more leaderboards in here where we didn't have leaderboards before, that's more manipulative. That's a more transparent, we're just trying to make you work harder. And that is probably not going to be perceived quite as positively in the current environment. So like many things, it depends. And I think it mostly depends on what the design and implementation process is. It has to be thoughtful. I hope at least at this point, way past, Gartner predicted in like 2016 that 80% of gamification efforts would fail. And the reason was because 80% of people doing gamification were doing exactly what I described earlier. They were just throwing game-looking stuff where it did not belong. I hope we're past that at this point. And instead, people approach this by saying, man, people are not having a good experience here. How can we take lessons from games and improve that experience for them? And that kind of gamification, what I would call like a more authentic gamification, or gameful design, another term that's used for it, that kind of approach, I think, would be perfectly well received at this point. There's a big difference in assessment, in testing. There's a big difference in gamifying by saying, let's make this a little bit more engaging and a little bit more interesting and a little bit more immersive. That's very different than let's dress up our assessment like a theme, like a carnival game, and have people play it. Like, those are very different things. So collecting adequate data to do that design process well is absolutely critical to making sure your outcomes are what you think they will be.
Yeah, I think kind of like that last part that you touched on there, we're kind of like dressing it up like a carnival, I think is one. Like Lance and I have been having some conversation where thinking that because getting a job is going to be so much more challenging, and the stakes of the selection process are going to feel so much higher, that potentially people's reaction to feeling like something is being dressed up like a carnival rather than really being job related, like that kind of like narrative approach that you were talking about at the beginning, where that feels like the gamification and the design used to make the experience better for both the candidate and the employer to understand if the job is the right fit. But something that doesn't feel job related, it feels like before people maybe just wouldn't have preferred it as much or would have liked it. Now we're almost wondering, could it make people angry? And talking about the negative press in terms of like, if you think about B2C companies, like you need to be thinking about what it, you know, how seriously it looks like you're taking this when it's really serious to the applicants and your consumers.
Oh yeah, we already see that. So I work with a company called Rebellion. They have a game-based assessment called Quantify. It's a cognitive ability-based series of mini games. But Quantify was originally a different game, which was called Theme Park Hero. And it was basically the idea is you would go between like carnival games, theme park games, one by one. And they had a whole bunch of, you know, very, I mean, well done, pretty backgrounds. It looked amazing. And the feedback they got from candidates was, this is not serious. This is not a thing I would realistically take. And so when they rebranded it as Quantify, they cut out all the theme parky stuff and just made it into essentially a series of puzzles. And in our research, we found that people actually preferred that to a traditional cognitive ability test. So a complete 180 from the theme park themed version of it. Just because, I mean, you do portray, it's essentially a branding exercise. You do portray what your organization represents. And if you're like, come play carnival games, like that's not the right message, maybe ever, but definitely not.
I mean, at the end of the day, it kind of goes back to what's been around for a while in the research of justice, right? The fairness. Does it feel that I'm being given my fair shot to put my best foot forward? Does this feel unfair? Does the process seem fair? And is it job related?
Yeah, you know, and I'll go a step further. It's humanity. We don't study it that way, but I would say it's recognizing that you are a human being and conveying that we understand that, that we know we're spending your time in the assessment context. We know we're spending your time. We hope that you'll have a good experience doing it. But at the end of the day, we know you need a job. Just to have that messaging throughout the experience is, yeah, absolutely critical.
Okay. Well, Richard, thank you very much for the time. I think, you know, we've taken up a lot of your time, and thanks for getting off even into the speculative part of the future of assessments and gamification. I appreciate your thoughts as always. So if people want to get in touch with you or learn more, is there a way they can contact you? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, probably the easiest way to get a quick chat in is actually Twitter at RNLanders. I'm try to be engaged there. I won't bore you with the research methods like Facebook groups I'm on, but Twitter is a good place to do it. Also, even email at rlanders@umn.edu. Happy to chat.
Okay, we'll put that in the show description. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.